see the book? The famous images of that era is this one I grabbed for my cover, which is a beating on the floor of the U.S. Senate. Senator Sumner from Massachusetts gave an abolitionist speech. He was a leading abolitionist, and he was sitting at his desk afterward. You know, what he was doing actually was using the franking privilege, which is where, you know, congressmen get to send out free mail back to their district. And he was kind of stamping copies of his speech to send back to his home. And he was so proud of it. It was a lengthy abolitionist speech. But Representative Preston Brooks from South Carolina came across the Capitol to the Senate side with a cane, burst into the Senate chamber while Sumner was sitting there stamping his speeches, and tried to kill him. Now, it was about ideology. It was a North-South conflict. Preston Brooks from South Carolina was absolutely a proponent of slavery, but Sumner did insult his family also. So it was a great 19th century moment. Not only was it about the great, you know, political divides of the country, but Sumner probably went a little too far in the ad hominem attacks on the Brooks family. So he did beat Sumner very soundly with this cane. Sumner almost died. It took him a couple of years to recover. But it wasn't the only, and Preston Brooks died within a year of some unknown causes. So but Sumner lived to be an old man and to be an abolitionist his whole life. But this was not the only incident of brutality on the floor of the House or Senate. I mean, there were bench-clearing brawls, there were fistfights, people pulled guns on each other. So again, you know, when you see those clips of incivility on the floor of Congress, you can put them in some kind of historical context. In any case, the Brooks-Sumner caning is an iconic moment in American history because it represents the kind of emotion out of control in a democratic society and even in the most hallowed halls of our legislature. It also gives you a sense of what was considered fair behavior, or at least the range of acceptable behavior. Many people in the South thought the beating was fair and justified, putting aside the honor of the Brooks family and the people who were insulted. It was about honor of the entire South. And the way Sumner tried to characterize slaveholders and the whole notion of slavery, you know, was thought to be a major insult to, again, the honor of an entire region. Again, makes us look a lot more civilized when you think about those periods, but it's not really a lot of comfort either, because that's not, you know, that people were trying to kill each other on the floor of the U.S. Senate doesn't really help us that much here and now, but it does give you some sense of the American struggle with civility and how long it's been. I don't mean to make incivility sound so ancient. You know, when you talk about duels and, you know, beatings on the House and Senate floor, sounds like it's really far away, but incivility rolled right with us into the 20th century from the 19th. Lynchings, for example, throughout the South were justified as a legitimate form of social action up until the 1960s. There was incivility and murder rooted in hate on the ground in the North and the South, but also woven through our political discourse. FDR, as a lot of you might know, was labeled a socialist and a fascist. A lot of the attacks on Obama sound very much like what FDR endured during his long presidency. Reagan was demonized as a monster, and maybe, well, I guess you don't remember that, but not so recent past. George W. Bush, you know, how many times was he called a village idiot? And other insults. So we need to put the name-calling context as well. This president is certainly not the first one to suffer that kind of madness. Incivility is worrisome in a lot of ways, but made much more worrisome by the diffusion of electronic media. For example, back in the mid-20th century, when social scientists were trying to figure out what is the effect of media going to be in our political discourse, there were two terrific sociologists at Columbia called Paul Lazarsfeld and Robert Merton, two of the great social scientists of the 20th century. They started to study media, trying to figure out what's its effect going to be on how Americans talk about politics and participate in politics. And this is in 1948, so they're talking about radio, which is so incredible, given that television wasn't to diffuse for a few more years. But they argued that too much attention to radio would cause what they called, and this is a great phrase to drop on people to impress them when you've come back from Washington and they say, what did you learn? Merton and Lazarsfeld said that too much exposure to media causes a narcotizing dysfunction. The dreaded narcotizing dysfunction. And their argument was that people who expose themselves to a lot of political media, so in our day it would be things like constantly watching CNN or Fox News or reading the Politico blogs, they replace doing with knowing. In other words, they think that because they know so much about politics, who's on top, who's on bottom, what are the politicians fighting about, that they're actually acting. So when they're really just sitting on a couch or sitting in front of their computer. So this is incredibly visionary for two people writing in the 1940s about radio, that media could have this debilitating effect on political action. It could make you think that you're doing something when you're really not doing anything at all. You have a lot of stuff in your head, you have a lot of information, but you're not acting on it. So this was very worrisome because before they wrote, people thought, well, more political information will make people want to act. You know, that having more political knowledge in your head will inspire you toward action and participation. But it turns out that's not the case at all, that it may have this debilitating effect. And I had a great example. Back when I lived in Chicago, we had some neighbors who had CNN on all the time in their kitchen. I mean, the houses were close together, so I wasn't trying to look in there. It's just that, you know, I could see it all the time on the screen. One of the people who lived in the house said that she was, quote unquote, a political animal. And I said, well, you know, I thought to myself, what does that mean? I mean, they do watch CNN all the time. They're very well educated. They're very knowledgeable about politics, but they don't act on politics. I mean, they may vote, but they don't do anything else. And I thought, aha, a great example of the Lazarsfeld and Merton narcotizing dysfunction. I'd go one step further than that. The narcotizing dysfunction, and argue that seeing incivility on television or on the internet may have that debilitating effect also. It's true that a lot of media figures that you're familiar with, that you see all the time, like Glenn Beck, you know, like him or not, have been able to encourage political activity. And so that kind of throws a little bit of a wrench in this. Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert as well. I mean, I'm not exactly sure what to call the rally on Washington last week. I wasn't there. Reports vary. A couple of my students were there, and, you know, I had some interesting insights. But on the whole, and so those are exceptional, though, that Glenn Beck or Jon Stewart can get all these people out to the mall for political togetherness of some sort. But on the whole, the political chatter that we see around us is not inspiring. It makes you want to avoid politics, just like the students in my survey. So I think that at the end of the day, the narcotizing dysfunction rules. I said in the beginning that I defend incivility a little bit, or at least defend a balance between civility and incivility. So a few words on that. The fact that incivility has been present throughout American history, but with different intensities and manifesting itself in different ways, it does make you wonder, do we like it? Do we like some of this incivility? People certainly find it useful, incredibly useful. I'd argue, in fact, that civility is not really a state of a nation, but it's a tool. Civility and incivility get used as strategic weapons, depending on what you're trying to get done. So, for example, all the negative advertising that you were subjected to during the campaigns this fall, it's there because it works. I saw that Celinda Lake was on your panel, I think the first day of your conference, and she's an expert on advertising and polling, so maybe she discussed this a little bit. But you wouldn't be seeing so many negative campaigns if it didn't move votes, if it didn't raise money, if it didn't get bases, either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, excited. So it's something to keep in mind. Dick Morris, I'm not sure what to call him, Clinton pollster turned Fox News Democrat basher, wrote recently, quote, "Voters see negative advertising as another form of information. They so distrust politicians that they want to see their opponents tear them down so they can get at the truth. In fact, voter attitudes toward politicians are akin to their opinions of criminal defendants." They could be forgiven for confusing the two. Just as juries want a prosecutor who tears the defendant apart and punches holes in his alibi, so they want a political candidate to run ads exposing his opponent. And he goes on and says, voters have a skilled baloney detector embedded in their consciousness. They know that politicians who have proclaimed their own honesty have ended up in prison, while others who say, read my lips, no new taxes, that's the first George Bush, have broken their solemn vows and jacked up taxes anyway. So they watch all television with suspicion. To succeed, negative ads must work overtime to get under the detector. So, you know, what Morris is saying here is that it's okay to have this much negativity, it's okay to have this much mudslinging, because people are smarter than that. What did he call them? They have good baloney detectors, and they want to see the rock and roll of politics because they are sophisticated enough and smart enough to weed through it and get what they need in terms of policy positions. I've argued less colorfully that we need to think about incivility as a strategic weapon. And if we do that, it's a lot less hurtful. I mean, if rudeness or even trash talk is seen as just talk, one weapon that you can use in a whole arsenal of rhetorical weapons, maybe it's a little less disturbing and a little less hurtful. So as I said earlier, you know, maybe we need to have a thicker skin to some extent in politics and not be so appalled and aghast at name-calling or insulting labels. You know, if it is free speech, why do we find it so problematic when we can use our own free speech back to defend ourselves, our positions, our fellow believers? When do we become so concerned with everybody's feelings and become so fragile with regard to free discourse? You know, are we a culture of very delicate flowers with little self-esteem, or are we a free, rough-and-tumble democracy with people who advocate, who argue, and can take the heat of what is a passionate argument? Going a little bit further even, maybe incivility is attractive to us. And this is the hardest thing of all to think about. It's always been part of American democracy. There must be something functional about it. There must be something attractive about it. I have a terrific colleague at the University of Texas, very much worth reading his work. His name's Rod Hart. He's the dean of the communication school there. At a conference recently, he outlined some of the reasons why he thinks incivility always pulls us in, attracts us, titillates us, makes us excited. Let me go through a couple of items on his list. Again, this is why incivility keeps on keeping on, you know, why it's always with us. First, he says it's dramatic. It's dramatic, and so it entices us. It's engaging. It pulls us in. It makes us listen. There's so much clutter out there in the media. When somebody raises their voices and starts yelling about health care or the deficit, that gets your attention, and it's exciting cognitively. Second, he says that, you know, one of the reasons incivility is attractive to us is that it's usually dialectical. In other words, it breaks up some very complicated issues down to two sides. This guy versus this guy, pro and con, Spitzer versus Parker, you know, pick your two sides. So even though the world is much more complex than that and much more multifaceted than that, and the positions are much more subtle, you know, the great thing about incivility is it tends to crystallize things into he said, she said, pro and con. And we like that because the world is confusing and it's messy, and when something can be put into two sides, it gives us some comfort that maybe we can understand this big morass somehow. Third, incivility is social in a weird way, but it is social. It connects people and ideas. Fourth, and he has a whole list of these, but I'll stop here. He says, and this is most interesting, incivility is gentrified. Or how he says, it's violence arrested, it's hate gone middle class. In other words, it's not all-out war, it's not caning, it's not fistfights. It's people yelling at each other on cable news. And so it's a kind of a gentrified form of violence that is, again, attractive to something in us as human beings. So that's interesting stuff to think about. And if Hart is right, if there's always going to be, and the historians as well, if there's always going to be some incivility in American politics, maybe it's up to us to recognize that, get used to it, put it in its place, and again, not be such delicate flowers about name-calling. The duels I think I could live without, but name-calling I think I could certainly get